All right, the wild world of independent and dependent clauses. Here we go. Start your note taking. So, the goal here is I can distinguish between the two. You can write an analogy comparing them, and that you can use this knowledge to write and punctuate sentences correctly. So, first things first. Clauses always have subjects and verbs in them. One subject and one verb minimum. Okay, if it doesn't have a subject and a verb, it's not a clause, it's probably a phrase. So we can break those clauses into two categories: independent, also known as main clauses, or dependent, also known as subordinate clauses. So an independent clause is the one that can stand alone as a complete sentence or thought, not a fragment. The dependent clause, though, on the other hand, cannot stand alone. It has a subject and a verb, but it is a fragment, and it requires a main clause to make sense. So here's an analogy that might help that be clearer. Think of a main clause as a manager. Think of the subordinate clause as the workers underneath that manager. The subordinate clauses cannot do the work without the manager's approval. Otherwise, chaos ensues. Thus, any subordinate clause always needs a main clause to manage them. So that means the workers cannot be left alone, just like the subordinate clause can't be, or it's a fragment. Or, if that didn't work, how about the independent clause is a parent, and the dependent clauses, or the subordinate clauses, are the children. Hence, the children depend on the parent's approval, assistance, etc. to do anything. You can't just have them wandering alone, otherwise it doesn't work. So, on your sheet, after you're done taking notes, I want you to think of your own analogy. So something besides the manager, worker, or parent's child situation that I've already covered here. So here's an example. Native Americans lived on the island until they were attacked. Native Americans lived on the island could be a sentence, but if I took the rest of it away and I just had until they were attacked, it's got a subject, it's got a verb, but this could not be its own sentence. And the subject for is Native Americans and lived for the independent clause. So here's a trick. You can check to see if a clause is independent or dependent by using putting at the beginning of the clause in question, it is possible that. If it works, the clause is independent, like this. It is possible that grew up in Palm Desert. Doesn't make sense, so that's dependent. It is possible that I am your 10th grade student this year. That makes sense. That is independent. It is possible that also to see that what your personality was. That's just a mess. So definitely not independent. It is possible that, for example, running, playing, jumping. Doesn't make sense. It's not independent. So for each of these, is it independent or dependent? Follow along with me. If you live on an island, dependent. The tides affect your life. Tides, affect is the verb. Independent. The water level rises. Level is the subject. Rises is the verb. Independent. When the tide comes in, dependent. Much of the beach disappears underwater. Independent. Until the tide goes out, dependent. So in the following sentences, which is the independent clause and which are the dependent clauses? So we have, although it was located next to a school, the Radiac Research Corporation was storing large amounts of medical waste. This is the dependent clause. The second one is the independent clause. Cleopatra lived in ancient Egypt, which she ruled. That should be on the same line. Cleopatra lived in ancient Egypt. That is the independent clause. Which she ruled, dependent. When a crowd gathered for a public rally, the teens told the people about Radiac, dependent, independent. Billy fell in the sewer on a neighborhood street as he was playing on a Saturday afternoon. So the first independent clause goes until neighborhood street, and then as he was playing on Saturday afternoon is dependent. So, how do I punctuate two independent clauses that are closely related? Option 1, put a semicolon between them. I like ice cream, semicolon. He likes cake. Of course, we could also put a period. I like ice cream, period. He likes cake. Or a comma and a coordinating conjunction. I like ice cream, comma, and he likes cake. The coordinate conjunctions are the fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. You need to know these. You should already know these. So if you don't, write them in your notes now. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So here are two independent clauses. I need new school clothes. I will go to the mall. Because they're independent, you can join them with the semicolon, like right here. Or we could say, I need new clothes, comma, so I will go to the mall. So being one of the fanboys. Now, here's another example. You've got independent, 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 independent. Now, independent with coordinating conjunction. Sometimes we can turn one of those independent clauses, though, into a dependent clause. And that is just by adding a word, like when here. When I went to the store, now it's dependent, I didn't buy any bread. So if our dependent clause is first, we have to have a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. But we could easily switch those, right? I didn't buy any bread when I went to the store. Note the lack of the comma here, because when the independent clause is first, there's no comma between the two clauses. As I just said, because I don't have a car, comma, I can't go off campus for lunch today. Dependent is first, needs a comma. It's like a pause, right? So when the subordinate clause or dependent clause goes first, you've got to pause before you get into the big managerial parental independent clause. I can't go off campus today for lunch because I don't have a car. So they're interchangeable. Whenever you begin a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, use a comma. I already said this. So just one more example. So here's some more sentences that work for that. So remember, if you're trying to figure out if something's an independent clause, you can put it's possible that in front of it. If it makes sense, it's independent. Here are some words that actually trigger something that's independent to become dependent when you put them at the front of the clause. So if it was, I like dogs, if you put because in front of that, it doesn't make sense anymore, right? Or when, or though, should have be on its own line. All of these, when added, make something dependent. So what I want you to do, follow along on your sheet and answer the following questions so that you can practice what you've just gone over.